Christian parenting. You're listening to the All Mom Does podcast, where you'll find encouragement, information, and inspiration for the life you're living, the kids you're raising, the romance you're loving, and the faith you're growing. I'm your host, Julie Lyles-Carr. Let's jump into this week's episode. You are in for a treat today. I have Tracy with me. I am very fortunate in that I get to call her friend, and I've also got to have a lot of fun watching her on a variety of different TV shows, getting to work with her on a couple of productions, all kinds of things. Julia, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
So give my listeners a little history about you and how you ended up going into film, acting, stage, all the things.
Yes. Well, I started acting as a kid, actually. And, I did my first movie. I did a PBS movie. It was one of those anti-drug movies called Private Victories when I was 18. And all my friends went to LA, and I was like, oh, aren't you supposed to go to college? So I went to college, and then I took a little detour with the African, well, it's not really a detour because I've been with the African Children's Choir since 1992, but I really wanted to kind of work in ministry, and we had this kind of revival that happened at our university the last year, but I realized that, my calling was still in the arts. Even though I was working in the arts, there were still other things that I wanted to do. So I spent a decade in New York doing television and film and stage and writing, and then continued that in Austin, Texas for another decade.
One of the things about you that I think is so fascinating is you chose to be part of a documentary that recorded the birth of your son for all the world to see, your home birth with Ricky. Like, how did you end up in that endeavor? I mean, who talked you into that? How did that go?
What's funny is my sister, who's maybe 14 years younger than I am, went to my visit with my midwife, and she was like, "You should do that." I'm like, "I'm not doing that." And my sister was so much younger than me that I think I kind of wanted to be cool for her. I was in my 30s. So I was like, fine, I'll call them, Well, the funny thing about that is I made them sign a little thing that no nudity. I mean, which is really silly because for a documentary giving birth, the women, I get it, like you can be naked. But I just thought for myself and my own personal faith and all of that I said, no nudity. So they did end up filming everything. And when they went to cut the film, they did have a picture of Xander coming right out. And when I watched it, I just had him and I was crying. And I told my husband, like, this is so beautiful. This is natural. Like, this is the way it should be. And he looked at me kind of sideways. He's like, you're going to leave it? I was like, yeah. I mean, anyway, so he's like, okay, if that's what you want to do. And so I messaged the director and the producer, and they said, oh, we had already cut the film, because I took like a week to get back to them. So they had already cut the film. So the film cuts, you don't see any of my private parts. You just see my son like going onto my chest. And every time I'm in church, every time like I go to new church, somebody says, oh, we saw you in that documentary. And I'm always like, thank you, Jesus. Yes.
Yeah.
People are not seeing my privates.
But it does bring up an interesting question, because you have, for the most part, been engaged in film and television that has not been geared necessarily for the Christian market. And yet I know that you're a person of very strong faith. I have other friends who are actors, musicians, whatever, and they've chosen to stay completely in the Christian market. And yet I know from watching your interaction, the people that you love, the friends that you've gathered, it's been really important for someone like you, a person of faith, to be in an industry, in the side of the industry that is not always speaking Christianese. So how did you make that decision? Because I would have to think there was some pressure. There was a lot of soul searching to decide what you wanted to do in that circumstance.
Well, when I started in the business, I mean, I don't know how to say this kindly, but there weren't any good Christian movies really. And so I want to do something that has quality, and so I just went into the secular world, but I was a Christian. And with most of my friends in New York that were actors, none of them were Christians. I was the only one who went to church and was active in my faith. But for the most part, I had respect for that. But I did have to make choices. So I was certainly offered parts that I had to turn down that I'm sure were frustrating for my agent. There was, I don't know if you remember that show Rescue Me. Boy, they really wanted me on that show. And there was, I mean, there was a graphic sex scene, and I just had to say I can't do this, which I know for a lot of people listening, they're like, "Oh, of course you had to say no." But let me tell you, when you're in the business and somebody's offering you a job, it is not. It's hard, and you have all these people that expect you to make money for them and all those things. So I just chose roles that I knew I could still have my faith and there's a lot of things out there for that. But it's really hard it's easier for me now because I'm older. So I'm playing the mom, and nobody wants to see a mom have sex really. So it's fine. But 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 when you're but when you're in your 20s and you've got a hot body, like that's kind of what everyone wants you to be, that sexy girl. And so that required me to just know what my line was. These are the things I'm going to do, and these things I won't do.
I love that you're honest about the difficulty of that, because I think sometimes we seem to elevate people who, and I understand it, but we elevate people who are that, and they wanted me to do thus and such. And I was like, absolutely not. And yet, when you've been going after a goal, when you are getting all kinds of accolades, when you have people who really seem to want you to do certain types of things, it can be a lot more difficult than just, I know where my boundaries are and that was it.
Yeah.
How did you manage when these doors were opening? And a lot of times, particularly because we're people of faith, we feel like when we see doors opening that maybe God's behind it. And yet you had to really discern, oh yeah, this door is opening, but this is not a God door. How did you work with that, particularly when you had a lot of pressure all around you from people who cared about you, who wanted to see your career rise and do well? How were you able to discern what a God door was and what was not?
I mean, sometimes we don't always make the right decisions. And I'm sure that there were things that decisions that I made that maybe I shouldn't have, and we learned from them. But I think the most important thing for me was having spiritual accountability in my life. And we were in New York kind of around the time during 9/11, and we were going to a really big church in New York City. And so, like, the small groups were 100 people.
Yeah, yeah.
It was in Times Square. And we ended up being a part, my husband and I ended up being a part of starting a small church. And I think that really helped because even if I didn't ask somebody, I knew that somebody was going to know if I did something that maybe would have gone against my philosophy or my beliefs or whatever. And so, and it is very difficult being a Christian in New York City. It was funny because when I moved to Texas, people started asking me what church I went to, and it was the strangest question because nobody ever asked you that in New York.
In New York.
What? You actually think that I might go to church? So, but at the same time, I actually think that being a person of faith in a city like New York or Chicago or LA, you are actually a Christian. Whereas you can live in the South and go to church and really not have much faith because everyone around you is kind of talking the same language.
Right. You have to fight for it more.
Hmm.
It's been interesting because I've had so much fun seeing both some of the short films that you've been writing and directing and producing and acting in. It's been really exciting to see a lot of those come out. And then it's been super fun to be with you when your appearances on Nashville and Fear the Walking Dead came out. How did those opportunities come about? Because I'm sure there had to be a certain sense when you left New York and you headed to Texas. Yes, there's some film production here in Austin, and we're seeing more and more of that come to bear. But in the time that you and I have lived here over the last 10 years, it hasn't been this incredibly robust place to do a lot of film. So when you've had these opportunities come, what has that been like post your New York years?
I mean, I think my expectations just changed. We chose to move to Austin for family and for a different lifestyle. And so my expectations of how much I was going to work and audition changed. In New York, I was auditioning, I don't know, 5 or 6 times a week. I was working all the time, even if it wasn't a television show, it was on a commercial or something else. And so I think that I just had to. So of course, when I get the opportunity to work on television or film again, I'm super excited and I love to do it. It's also probably one of the reasons why I've started. I mean, I started writing and telling my own stories in New York, but I'm doing it a lot more here because I feel a great sense of value being able to tell my own stories as opposed to being in somebody else's. Although I love that too, and I love acting, but it's allowed me a creative freedom being here that I may not have explored if I had stayed in New York.
With your husband, Van, who I just dearly love. He's such an amazing guy, also an actor, and he's had some really amazing career changes and turns that have been fascinating to watch. How did you guys make the decision? You had your line that you knew in terms of sexual content, things like that. But then you also have kind of this interesting thing that I watch some other actors of faith go through where a scene isn't particularly, heavily sexual, but it requires you kissing someone who's playing the part of your husband. How did you guys make decisions about things like that? Because I've known people of faith as actors who have made the decision that's never going to happen. And then I've also known people who they've talked it out, maybe both spouses are professional actors and they understand a little bit more about the industry. It doesn't bother them as much. How have you guys made those decisions that maybe not everybody would completely understand?
I think because Van is an actor, he understands that if I'm playing somebody's spouse on Nashville and we have to kiss, he just understands that's part of the job. So there's never been any kind of weirdness or jealousy or anything like that. The only time I remember, I tested for all my children, which, for if you don't know, they narrow it down to this would be series regular on all my children, not just a one-time role or whatever. And so you go into the studio and you test with the lead. Maybe I'll tell you that story later. But but I knew. Okay, I'm going to tell the story. So I knew the lead. His name, Michael Knight. For those of you who watch it, I think that's his name. He played Tad in the show, and I actually had done a show with. I had actually done class with him, so I knew him. And we got there. I can't remember telling you this. And you go into the studio. It's a lot of pressure. You do the rehearsal. Michael was super sick, so there was a kiss. So he didn't kiss me in the rehearsal because he wasn't feeling well. But when you go in the studio, you're in the studio. You've got all the cameras. The director's there. You do the whole thing, and then you kiss. Well, I had never kissed on a soap opera before. And so, anyway, so we go for the kiss, and Michael opened his mouth, and it was reflex,
Yeah.
And Michael was like, I could tell he was like freezing up, like, what is she doing, And then I was like, oh yeah, I guess I don't know what just happened. So anyway, we did the whole thing, and it worked out fine, but I came home and told my husband that story. And he was like, you did what? And I was like, I don't know. It was just a reflex. It just happened. So he wasn't mad at me. I mean, it was like we were acting, and I was so embarrassed because I'm sure Michael was like, this girl doesn't know how to do a soap opera kiss. You're just supposed to keep your mouth open and move around.
Yeah.
Anyway, so then I didn't get it. Shocker. But you sign the contract, you're going to be getting all this money and all this. So we watched the first episode. Van and I did, just to see who they cast. Of course, they cast someone 10 years older than me, so I felt great. But this opening scene is her laying in bed in like a teddy, like a sexy teddy, and then them like kind of kissing and rolling over. And he looked at me and he was like, I'm so glad you didn't get that.
Yeah.
Part. So, some of those things, even though you think you really want them, you realize, yeah, I didn't need that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's such a difficult thing to navigate, to determine. And little known fact, my husband he actually auditioned for a soap opera and, looked like he might potentially get it. And I was like, I don't think I can handle that. Like, I don't think I trust him, and I know that he would be a great role model to people. And I know that level of platform could be really interesting, but I don't think I could handle that. And I think that it's important that couples who are in those lines of work, because let's face it, it's not just in secular film and theater. It's also in Christian-based film and theater. Sometimes this requirement for romance or whatever is part of the story. So I do think it's important that every couple know what their line would be when it comes to those kinds of moments and to work it out. I mean, that's one of the things I have always admired about you and Van is the level of relationship and friendship you guys have as part of your marriage. What do you think is one of the challenges when a person of faith is on set? I mean, how is that regarded? Did you find that for the most part, people have been really accommodating and appreciative that you have something that you ground your life in? Is it something that you've had to fight against some stereotypes? Maybe people thinking that you would be, I don't know, a different person than you are when it comes to the creative space. What has that experience been?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's actually a lot of Christians in this business now, whether it's the person doing your makeup on set or, I just worked on a TV show and my husband, after talking to him, I realized that he was a Christian too. And I think that we're just seeing a lot more people of faith going into Hollywood because, you know, for so many years we were told if we wanted to really please God, we would become a pastor, we'd become a missionary. And I'm glad that the narrative has changed because we were absent from Hollywood. Faith was absent from Hollywood for decades. And now we're seeing it come back in through writing. I'm a part of Act One, which is a writing group in LA. If anyone is a good writer and they're Christian, you should look up Act One. I'm a graduate of that. And they're really trying to change Hollywood from the inside. Like let's write some shows about redemption. Let's get some characters out there that have quality. So that we're otherwise we're letting other people write something about a Christian, and they don't know that's not them. So I think that it's changing. I think the hardest thing that I had was more probably with my friends that were colleagues and other actors. I definitely had someone break up with me because I was a Christian, like a girlfriend. I've had the whole, I'm going to take you to lunch and I don't think I want to hang out with you anymore, which is really hard. But I don't know. I mean, I think that those things all happen for a reason too.
Right, right. With your kids, they've been involved in some of the endeavors that you and Van have been part of, some of the movies that you've made, different commercials, different, all kinds of things that you do. Do you think either of them are going to go for it? Do you think they're going to head into the industry? And how do you feel about that? Because it's one thing to do it for yourself and to experience it. It's another thing to have your child, knowing the challenges that you've faced, knowing the things you've had to stand firm on, knowing the times that you've been like, maybe that's not what I should have done. What do you think about if the kids decide they want to do this?
Well, both of my kids have been acting since they were little, whether it's in commercials and even Lydia, when she was younger, she did a little television show. But in other words, it wasn't a long running show. I think that one of my kids would probably be very interested in making this as a career, but it's one of the reasons why we didn't move back to New York and we didn't move to LA. Them doing acting here in Austin is a totally different thing. It's on a different level, the stress level. It's just like doing something every once in a while or working on a commercial or a one part. And it's one of the reasons why I started teaching because I didn't trust anyone, to teach my kids because sometimes us creative people can be a little weird. So I started teaching acting. And I still do. I do a camp in the summer, and I teach on camera audition technique, and so really, it's just become like kind of a part of our family DNA culture.
Right, right. It's just part of what y'all do. So, it's interesting to me because you brought this up in a previous statement that you made that a lot of times if we don't engage in some of these spaces, then we're allowing the story of people of faith to be told by people who may not have that experience. Or we're also allowing content to be developed that might not have an infusion from a faith perspective. And I think part of what's interesting is at times it feels like we've sort of abdicated. I think it's great that there are all kinds of different media and things that are developed specifically for people in the faith space. But if part of the mission is to reach people who are never going to go to those kind of channels or aren't going to go, they're not going to trend toward those kind of films or different offerings, then how do we step in the gap and make sure that that voice is heard, that message of grace is available, even if it's just through someone's presence in something? Why do you think we have gotten to the place in previous years? And it's good to hear that you think that it's changing now, but why do you think we got to the place in previous years where we did sort of abdicate things? Because Julie, when I think about where the arts really found a huge level of genesis. It was arts for the church. It was, the best craftsmen making these incredible cathedrals. It was the best composers writing music. And, in the early days of theater that we think of in the way now, that was done as a means of teaching people Bible stories. We often forget that was it was a society that not everyone was literate. And so this was a way in which you could help communicate what the stories of grace and of Jesus were about. Why do you think that we sort of just backed up from all of that and for many years kind of absconded from it?
Well, I just watched Footloose again, the original Footloose.
Yeah.
And,
Oh,
and it
yeah.
kind and it kind of reminds me of my own childhood. I mean, my stepdad said no secular music. We couldn't, no movies. There was no TV shows. So if you remove yourself from what is pop culture, what's the culture around you, how in the world can you affect it? So that was kind of, where we were in the 80s and part of the 90s. And I think there were a lot of organizations like Act One and Master Media and different organizations that said, no, 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 we have to be in the marketplace and we have to be the best at it. So you look at movies that are coming out now that have, I Can Only Imagine, The Chosen, they're high quality films and the filmmakers are incredible and they're telling really good stories. So other people are going to see it. So I think this is kind of an exciting time because of the quality of content that's out there.
It feels to me there's been a real, if you will, democracy movement that has happened within the arts because with the advent of YouTube channels and you can shoot reels on social media and all of these different things, you're seeing so much talent come to bear that is not having to go through the same set of hoops that you would have had to have gone through 20 years ago when it comes to being able to get your message out and get your story out. How do you think that YouTube, Netflix, social media, all the things, how do you think that's changing the way we're telling stories today?
Oh, I mean, in every way, it's changing it. But so, we have a lot of young people, and by young people, I mean 8 to 12-year-olds who are out there telling stories. I mean, I can't imagine what that must be like. So, I don't know how it's all going to play out, but I do think that it's possible that people will be watching less TV and going to less movies in 10 years from now and watching stories on TikTok, and that could be the way things are going, which means it blows apart the entire system of Hollywood, which is you have an agent, your agent submits you to a casting director, they cast the film. I mean, if people right now, anybody can make it with their iPhone 12, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's scaring probably a lot of the studios too, which is why everything that you see is just basically a remake because they know people will go and watch it. But it's also a really exciting time for us who aren't a part of a big studio to put out something beautiful that people will watch, even if what if it's just 10,000 people that watch it? You know, I mean, that could be really exciting as opposed to millions of people watching it on NBC.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting because there are a lot of geniuses that we probably haven't heard from in the past because they couldn't get to where they needed to get to to have the gate open for them. And now all of that's down. So I'm right with you. I think there's going to be some really fascinating things that come out of the place where everybody's got this incredible technology in their hands and they can broadcast immediately. It's going to be really interesting. So I want to do a little bit of a hard turn because we've been talking about your producing and writing and being on camera and all the things part of your career. But you've also had this other part of your career that you mentioned at the top of the interview with African Children's Choir. And so it's so amazing to me the breadth of experience that gives you to be in more of a secular space when it comes to your own acting career. And yet you've also been with this incredible, incredible organization for all these years. Let the listeners know what African Children's Choir is and how you are able to speak into the lives of these young people in a different kind of musical space that is more geared toward churches and people of faith and those kinds of audiences.
Yes, so the African Children's Choir has been around since '84. And all of our children, once they come into our program, part of the program is this musical tour because our children either came from war situations, many of them were orphaned, They come from very vulnerable environments. And so the tour really helps them see their future. If you grow up and you have an open running sewer in front of your house and you've never been to school, you don't know that a nurse is a job or that you could be a businessman. And so the tour really gives them so much confidence. And then when they go back to their African nation, we pay for their education through university and many of them in our own schools. So they come to our boarding schools. We don't really, I don't want to say we don't believe in orphanages because orphanages definitely serve their purpose. But these children, even if they don't have parents, they have an aunt, they have an uncle, they have a grandma, and we want them to be connected to their community. So we help take care of the education. They live with us during the school year. And then on holidays, they go home. And what we've seen is that they have such a passion for their communities that they are changing their community. So just by helping the one child, we actually help the whole family because we relieve the financial pressure. And then the families also kind of rally around. They're so proud of their child. So we've seen all of these communities just have incredible change. And so a lot of the children that I worked with, I started out right after college. It was my first job, and by job I mean volunteer. And I was just going to do it for 8 months, and then basically moved to LA, and I fell in love with the choir and the culture, and I ended up living in East Africa for many years and doing relief and development work. Many of the children that I worked with in the early to mid 90s are now adults themselves, and I'm so proud of them. And because of WhatsApp, I get to keep in touch of everyone with
Right,
everyone.
right.
So every day I get a message from one of my quote unquote kids. They call me auntie, and it really just has become a second family to me. And I've been with them for 28 years. So at first I was organizing like the audition process and the training and all of that, but now I oversee their tours and the musical production and special events and all of that and the albums. So I'm the creative officer. Yeah.
I think what's really beautiful in talking about the art space is that you see some of these kids come from pretty dire circumstances, and their lives are so beautifully enhanced by the work that African Children's Choir does. And you also see how the arts elevate their ability to understand what is possible. What is it like to watch these kids who, again, may have come from extremely difficult circumstances and watch them perform? Because I got to tell you, Julia, of several of the choirs that I've been able to see, and a couple of my kids went to Africa to see the work that was going on there, all of that. Some of these kids are such naturals. I mean, they're incredible. I mean, their level of musicality and dance and expression is just off the charts. And you stand there going, I know these kids have not had access to formal training or anything, and here they are. It really blows my mind.
Yes. Also music's just such a part of their culture and the drums and all that. That all happens from a really young age. And that's all just a part of being in the community. But you feel the presence of God on them when you're watching them. And I've seen thousands of concerts and I still cry whenever I watch them. But we had a psychologist come, this is years ago, and he was watching the performance and he said, some of the dance moves that the kids are doing are what we would do in our therapy sessions. And I just feel like that's just the Lord because we didn't know that,
Yeah.
So the actual part of also performing and feeling important and special is really changing for them as well. So yeah, there's a lot of therapy that takes place with both the singing and the dancing and all of that.
Yeah, yeah. It really is something to be able to see them. And if you have an opportunity, if they're coming to your area, you definitely want to take the time to go and experience the African Children's Choir. Julia, what do you say to those parents out there that they have a child who seems to be expressing a lot of interest into looking into auditioning for things, and the parents are concerned? It's like, I don't want to lose my kid in the interest of this vocation and the interest of this obsession with performance. I mean, I understand why parents get really nervous about a child who seems to have some talent and really wants to push to go to Los Angeles or New York and audition and all the things. What do you say to those parents about both the cautions and the encouragement that you have for them?
I think the caution is legitimate. I have that for my kids too. And my daughter's, she's all about the acting and singing and all of that. I just think that you have to spend a lot of time in prayer. And if you feel like it's taking over your life, then don't do it. It's not worth it. Childhood is way more important than having a childhood is more important than being on the Disney Channel, you know? So, and this is the thing, once the children are 18, they can go to LA, they can go to New York, you know, it's not like they've missed their opportunity. So but I will say that there's so many things that you can do in your own community, whether it's theater or a local agent and doing commercials and things like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if you feel the call to go to LA, then that's different. I just think that it's for every family, they have to really be prayerful about that. We wouldn't want to uproot our whole family to go to LA right now, you know, for our 11-year-old. It just doesn't seem like that doesn't seem the right thing.
Right, right. And there may be families that it is the right thing to do, but that willingness to seek and to not let something become really overwhelming, that's really great advice. How have you handled, you know, we want to believe strongly that we are God's children and we want to see ourselves that way. We want to understand our value in him. And yet when you're talking about the entertainment industry, you are talking about setting yourself up for rejection over and over and over. Just like the publishing world, just like other forms of media, it is one of the few places where you just sign up vocationally to get told no all the time and to be told that you're, in some ways, you're not enough, you're not the thing we're looking for, you're not enough this, you're too much of that. How have you navigated all of that with your heart and leaned solidly into your identity as a child of God?
I think it definitely created a tough skin for me all those years of acting. And also, I had something else in my life that had value, and that was my work with the African Children's Choir. And I think that that's really important, that as an actor or an artist, if it can't be your everything, you have to have something else in your life that gives you joy and because if it's all that, I think that then it is kind of terrifying if you don't get that job.
Right, right. And that's the place where I think we have seen people in the past. And what's interesting, Julia, is this is something that can happen within the Christian entertainment industry. I mean, this is not something that is only part of the secular entertainment industry. There are plenty of places and spaces where you could audition for something, you could write something, you could go out for a part or whatever within Christian spaces and not get it. And it really is a tough thing to navigate. I love that you designate that having something that is giving your life purpose apart from all of the auditions is such a critical component. How do you think that things will change moving forward? Obviously, we talked about with sort of the democratization of the arts, of being able to put your stuff out there, whether that's music, painting, acting, all the things, and not being dependent on the system that's been developed over time. But it feels like to me, I'm seeing this transition where things do feel very story driven in a fresh way. There seems to be a real attention put on that. Is that something that you feel like you're seeing? And what do you think that's going to mean moving forward in terms of what we embrace as the forms of entertainment that we're involved with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like even with my own children, you know, my son prefers to play a video game. Not he does like to watch movies, but over watching a television show. So hey, wouldn't it be great if we had lots of Christians in the video game industry creating video games that at least there was some redemption, or there's a lot of concern on that. So I think that there are going to be so many different ways that people are getting their entertainment over the next 10 to 20 years that it'd be great if Christians thought about how to get into all of them.
I love that. Such words of wisdom. Well, Julia Barnett Tracy, so honored to call you friend. Thank you so much for your open heart and your open hand with the experiences that you've had. And I just can't wait to see it in whatever the next thing is. You always dazzle me every few months. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm going to be on blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, what? So it's just so fun to get to see your career, get to see all the things that you've gotten to do. Such a multifaceted approach to everything that you do in the arts. And I just love you, friend. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you so much.
Check out the show notes for all the links, info, and other goodness from this week's episode with a big thank you to our content coordinator, Rebecca. I've got a request. please go like and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does make a difference in helping other people find the show. And I'll see you next week here at the All Mom Does podcast.